The next piece that gets performed here is on the Chatfield instruments. You'll be able to tell any significance difference. I've been told that they're really well made, and that's good to hear. We now like to hear from Scott Sleider, who has taken on the project of restoring these, which is at the behest of Joseph Moylan, our high school principal. Felt he'd like to leave some kind of a legacy of his tenure here, and so he took on this project. Let's welcome Scott. You need some help over there?
Whenever I look at these, I always think I don't know where to start. That's exactly what I told Joseph Moylan when he brought him in. But I started violin repairs when I was 13 in 1968, and went to Chicago, got my master's, and returned to Milwaukee in 1980. And shortly after that, I got a phone call from a maker, a hobby maker named Alan Buffmeyer, who lived on the north end of the lake, that way, right? So, and he had some association with Frank Chatfield. And that's the first time I actually heard of Frank Chatfield. And he, I don't know what extent that he worked with him, but he had this perfect. Thanks. So they obviously spent some evenings together because Alan's violins look very similar to Frank's. And Alan had all the wood stock that Frank had at his death. And these instruments were made out of wood cut from this area. So maple and, maple side, back, and scroll. And I actually think the spruce on the top here is also from this area. So there are probably some pretty big pine trees or spruce trees in the area back in the 1920s and whatnot. Now, unfortunately, I lost a photograph. I had what Alan Buffmeyer had a photograph of Frank that he had just felled a maple tree. And it was dated like, I think, the 20s or something like that. And after, this would be about 1982 or something like that. So after 3 moves and, subsequent years, I've misplaced it, but if I ever find it, I'll give it to, to the, at the school there where they're holding the instruments, And so that, like I say, since, with working, I worked as a maker and a repairman. So I saw maybe, after about 1980s, like I say, I hadn't heard of him before. And, so I maybe saw about 10 instruments of Chatfield's in the meantime. And so fast forward now to about 2015 or 16, Joseph Moylan comes in with these instruments, and like I say, they had been in the school system for, I don't know, probably 37 years or so.
1937.
Okay, yeah, 1937. So that's, pushing almost 80 years that they were in a school system, and it really showed. This cello was probably the worst. Now, just bear in mind, when cellos, these instruments from, like, say, the 1700s or so, we didn't have standardized stairs, so you always see old instruments with all the lower ribs are always smashed and shattered. This was no exception, even with standardized stairs and whatnot. So when I took this on, first off, I told Mr. Moylan, I said, maybe you could take this money on the restoration and buy a whole group of new instruments for the school. But he really kind of stressed to me the historical significance, to the Oconomowoc region. And, like I say, so thinking you have to really thank Mr. Moylan for kind of bringing them into me and having that vision. And like I say, when I first got them, I said to myself, I don't know where to start. Where do I start with this? But, so as a maker, the first thing I do when I'm building an instrument is I start with the rib structure. And so what I did with all the instruments at the start, and thankfully, like I say, Mr. Chatfield used traditional wood, traditional glue, which is reversible for conservation. It's animal hide glue. It's water soluble, and it's easy to come apart. And I use traditional varnish, so that actually made my job a lot easier. And so all the instruments, there's about 80 parts on the instruments. And so the first thing I did when I got them in, this is another instrument here, not a Chatfield, but I remove the top. They come off by mechanical means with the glue. The glue kind of runs once you get going. The instruments are really held together with contraction. So with the glue, as you're heating it, and with the water, it expands, and as the humidity comes out of it evaporates, it's held together by contraction. And so the cello basically, it already came to me with broken parts, and scroll, the neck was off. The viola here actually didn't even have a scroll. It wasn't even around, nobody knew where it went to. So the first thing I did was I took the tops off of everything and just kind of assessed what I needed to do. Now bear in mind, like I say, the instruments have about 80 parts total. And I think with the cello, I probably got to about 65 parts off of the instrument in order to restore it. So the back center seam was open. It was a lot of work and time. So the way I approached it was, like I said, I pulled the instrument apart. I only worked on one or two at a time so that I wouldn't feel overwhelmed with a project of this size, which would be easy to do. And so I built a new rib mold, interior mold for the cello ribs so that I could firm it up and keep it solidified while I was working on the top. And so what I brought, the instruments also had, with the level of repairs that were done, and nothing against the stores that were doing the school repairs, but sometimes they may have shortcutted a couple things, so it made it a little more difficult at a time. And for instance, the arching on the top had sunk over a half an inch on that side, on the treble side. So what I did with each of the instruments got a plaster cast made of both the top and the back. And so what I was doing then, I would make like a negative that would fit precisely into there. And by using, say, a line and a reflection with light, I could determine where the sunken areas were. I could recarve this negative mold, and then I would press out with heat and reshape the top. So all the instruments got the plaster cast and some arching, and it just facilitated, whether I was doing patches for sound post cracks and whatnot. And which you may not realize, but wood, this is a rib, a straight rib. So the ribs come off of a slab off the back. And lignin, which is a component in the wood, becomes pliable at 180 degrees. And so with heat and moisture, I'll just briefly immerse, the rib. And then this will be heated and it holds its shape. So that's kind of the same principle with re-arching the tops and whatnot. So I have, the cello took the most, the most amount of work of any of the instruments. And the scope of the project, what we came up with was not to restore these to mint or new-like condition, like that never were played, So a lot of them you'll see, even with some of the patches. For instance, this was an original patch I left in, but there's multiple patches all around where there were actually daylight. It looked like a pumpkin, kind of, with holes everywhere. So what I did with the ribs is that I have to make, on most of the instruments, I would make, once again, counterparts. So this is for a violin, actually, but I made them for the cello size as well. So I would reshape the ribs, be able to press in, and with those holes, if you imagine a pyramid shape, I put a pyramid-shaped plug from the inside coming out so that it wouldn't slip any further out. And then all the ribs with the damage, I actually put another lining in the entire, so I made a second rib for the upper and lower bouts. and press that in using molds like this. So it's reinforced. Those patches are all cut down, and then with these, what you see here are linings which actually just help with gluing surface to the top and the back. And all the ribs that were lined have additional, I had to replace those. So I used wood similar to what he used, which were spruce. You know, and the idea with a restoration on these instruments is, you know, you don't want your signature to come through. You want them to look like Frank Chatfield's instruments. So I replaced, you know, all the blocks on the cello here. All the instruments had upper and lower blocks, which are these blocks here, because all the necks had to be reset. So it was just easier with margin. You always have a little overhang where the ribs are. And some of them had swelled a little bit. As wood shrinks, it'll come sideways and the ribs popped out a little bit. So I had to realign the rib and overhang on all the instruments. Like I say, the cello was the most extreme, you know, of the group. But, you know, like I say, him having used traditional glue and everything, it just made everything a lot easier. You know, I think that he was probably a amateur maker. I don't really know what association he had with other makers, but one of the instruments, like these three instruments here, are all very similar, and the other one's just deviates a little bit. So these were made on the same kind of principle. The other one, even though it has his F-holes and somewhat of the scroll, he just kind of, I think he was making a little bit of a advancement, more or less, but that was in 38, I think, from that instrument. But these three look just like twins, you know, actually, you know. But so with cello too, it, like I say, the neck was broke. It had been repaired multiple times. So what I did is I retained the original scroll. The original scroll is retained, and this wood here, the neck, is actually grafted in to the head. So I made a new fingerboard and a whole new neck, had a proper projection on it, and then retained, you know, the scroll to go along with the instrument. You know, the complete setup on everything was all new on all the instruments. I didn't want to cover up. Look, I already had probably about 700 hours into the group of instruments, so to do the varnish work would have been a whole nother project, and it wouldn't have sounded any better or different. And like I say, with the discussion we had, we wanted them to show that they had some history, you know, in the school system, you know, and I think that, you know, these instruments are going to last a full another 80 years, you know, of playing. So what I did with this instrument, it came to me with just the neck, and the volute, the scroll, was gone. And so what I did is I carved a new scroll, you know, in the style of the other instruments, you know, to go with it, and then grafted it on to the neck, you know, and so that's all, you know, back together with. But most of them had sound post cracks. So like I say, it was just a huge undertaking. And with the varnish, like this, I don't know if you can catch a reflection a little bit. The bow was in the case, with these student level cases, and the bow was scratching this for probably 2 decades or more. And so instead of grafting in, like I say, we just kind of left a lot of the wear, kind of toned it down a little bit, you know, just for playability. You know. So, I mean, it's been a pleasure to work on these, you know, and I hope that maybe someday somebody might do something like that for my instruments, you know.
And, I think we need to really thank this gentleman for taking this project on. How many hours did you say? 600? 700 hours. Now the music that we'll play next will be with the Chatfield instruments. And written by I'd like to introduce Ryan Grundstrom, who is the composer of this piece, who has come out from Washington, D.C. for this performance. So let's give a welcome to Ryan.
Thank you all for coming. So Roberta Carpenter asked me to write a piece to be played on these newly restored Chatfield instruments. So the Oconomowoc Chamber Orchestra, maybe you can better explain it, had a relationship with the composer Crawford Gates. Do you want to say something about Crawford briefly?
Crawford Gates was who wrote the Fanfare for Lake Country for us. It's the piece that's for our area, which we then had made into instrumental arrangements, short, medium, long. So every instrument, every person who's playing an instrument in Oconomowoc could play our tune. And then now we had this opportunity to work with Brian to have our Fanfare, and it's written for orchestra originally, but we didn't have it for just strings or string quartet. Enter Brian.
So it was almost like I was in college and was given an assignment. Take this melody, make a piece. So actually I have not warned Paul ahead of time, but would you mind playing the main theme at A until measure 26? So this is the theme that I was given by Chadwick, okay? Great. So, like Beethoven, I like to take that melody and have fun with it, pass it around from instrument to instrument, break it up, make it slower, make it faster, and all that kind of good stuff. So I have an initial, the other thing I did is to give the piece some structure, it's kind of fast, slow, fast. Does that sound familiar? So we do an initial introduction where I take fragments of the melody, so you don't hear the whole theme right away. I kind of get clips of it, a little preview, and then it comes in, I play with it, and then have a contrasting thing. String instruments really sound good if you just let them play on sustained notes. So I did some slow part to really just kind of let that sonority shine. And then I slowly work the theme back into it, and then we end with a big exposition of the theme. So you can kind of, if you listen to it, you kind of fragments the theme, you get the full theme, you get an exposition, then you have a slow part, and then the theme slowly kind of works its way back in, and the tempo, well, the tempo doesn't really increase, but the motion increases. So, there you go.